Kasey. I'm gonna. This question's gonna go to Kasey first. All right, and gentlemen, who's next? All right, here we go. As president, Kasey, would you support legalizing marijuana, ending the drug war, and releasing nonviolent drug offenders? If so, do you support offering these people counseling and various services to help drug addicts rather than incarceration? Kasey.
100%, absolutely. Yeah, I would use my abilities as president to pardon everybody in prison for cannabis. I'd like to end the war on drugs also and make it a health issue rather than a criminal issue. I think people that lean into drugs usually are doing so by some kind of trauma in their life, and they do so as a coping mechanism. And by criminalizing them and putting criminal charges and fines and so on, locking them up, that isn't doing anything to help them with the things, the conflicts that they're dealing with and why they're leaning into drugs in the first place. Your body is your temple. You should be able to consume whatever you want without being criminalized, I believe. I believe, if anything, the war on drugs should be more directed towards the pharmaceutical industry. I think there needs to be some regulation on drugs that are man-made, and things need to be looked at whenever man is creating things or putting different chemicals in drugs and so on. But as far as marijuana or mushrooms, anything that comes from the earth naturally, I think should be fully legal. Anybody should be able to grow it in their backyard if they'd like to. But things against the pharmaceutical industry, I know they put red 40, yellow 5, blue 1, and that's a petroleum-based food coloring in all our food and drugs. There needs to be regulation on that. Europe has banned that. They're not allowed to do that. It causes ADHD, tumors, cancers, and so on. Nobody should be consuming petroleum, but the petroleum industry has been running this country for over 100 years, so they can get away with poisoning us in this country. And so as far as people consuming small amounts of drugs, and I would like to decriminalize that, but then, look at the bigger drug problem we have that's facing us in regard to the pharmaceutical industry.
Thank you. Shawn Howard.
Yeah, I would decriminalize marijuana. Actually, when I lived in Massachusetts a few years back, I had the opportunity to legalize it, and it was passed, not by very much, but Massachusetts legalized it for recreational use, and I think it was the eighth state able to do that.
Oh, Shawn, you're kind of going in and out right now.
I'm
So
gonna
it
give
seems,
you an extra 30 seconds because once we
yes,
get back
thank
to
you. Shawn, are you
yeah,
there?
Sorry,
yeah,
losing
you
connection here.
you can
Yes,
I'm
yeah,
gonna give you an extra 30 seconds.
Sorry, you got me back?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. As far as the overall war on drugs, I mean, you still have to stop the distribution of it. So if you've got a large scale distribution, you can put, I think you still need to keep the rules in place generally for that type of offense. But if it's small use, you're better off just letting those folks out of jail and saving it for the violent offenders.
Thank you. Mark Charles.
When Abraham Lincoln tried to end chattel slavery, he didn't do it because he cared about the value of black lives. He did it even though he was a blatant white supremacist. He did not believe that people of color should be citizens of this nation or have equal rights under the Constitution. And so when he did actually end chattel slavery with the amendment, the 13th Amendment, it didn't abolish slavery, it redefined and codified it under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. Now, Ronald Reagan, when he declared a war on drugs, this wasn't actually a war on drugs, it was a war on race. And he was using drug addiction as a way to incarcerate people of color. That war was actually perfected by Bill Clinton. In the 80s and 90s, the majority of people dying from opioid overdose was people of color. In the mid 90s to the late 90s, white people began dying at higher rates. And around the early 2000s, they actually surpassed people of color dying at a much higher rate. And in the early 2000s, their numbers shot up astronomically, much higher. This was about the same time that we began treating drug use not as a criminal offense, but as a healthcare crisis. We began developing life-saving techniques on the streets and treating it as a health crisis the way it should be treated. It took more white people dying than people of color before we begin to treat it that way. So absolutely, today we have a massive amount of people sitting in jail for things that are legal today. And it's because of this fact that we've protected the institution of slavery within our criminal justice system. We have to correct that. We have to remove these people from our prison system. We have to decriminalize some of these minor drugs so that we're not criminalizing drug use, but we're looking at other causes. And we have to find a different way to hold especially like the pharmaceutical companies accountable. When we have corporate executives making billions of dollars off of opioid addiction, and they're just getting a fine, while people who are selling some of these drugs that are now legal are still sitting in prison, that's a major problem. And so yes, we have to definitely untangle this history of the criminalization of drug use. We have to treat it as a healthcare crisis that it is, and we have to treat it equally across racial lines, which we have never done as a nation.
Thank you. Mr. Carroll.
As the other gentlemen have pointed out, this problem is much bigger than the original cannabis question that you asked. And we should be treating each of these as a health problem, an education problem. And when it's criminal, it is the corporate executives that have been putting it into our systems and making fortunes off of other people's misery. As a junior high teacher most of my career, I am aware that the developing brain up until about the age of 25, that development is retarded by marijuana. So I strongly support an educational program. I don't want to see young people using marijuana, but it's not, for them to be using it is not a crime to whoever is delivering it to them and making money off of their mental, the slowing down of their development. That's a crime. But the users who are in prison just because they're using it should be released today, and we should save any penalties for those that are, especially the large traffickers, the corporate leaders who are doing it. They are criminal behavior, and they are making money off of other people's misery, suicide, and death, and they have to be dealt with.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. I'm going to hand it over to Shane. Shane, you're up.